The world's largest economy belongs to one country, and everything you have been told about it is incomplete. China is slowing down, they say. True, but insufficient. China is drowning in debt, they say. True, but shallow. The real truth is far more interesting and far more dangerous. China is becoming the victim of its own achievements, an empire wounding itself with the weapon it forged. And that distinction changes everything. Because from the outside, it still looks like triumph. Record exports, gleaming factories, a pipeline of electric vehicles and solar panels large enough to power the entire world. But inside, profit margins are collapsing. Factories are moving more goods and earning less from every single one of them. And the only thing keeping the system standing is the unshakable belief that stopping would bring something far worse. This is the greatest economic trap in modern history. And to understand it, we have to go back to the very beginning. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping stood before the Communist Party and demolished a century of dogma with a single sentence: getting rich is patriotic. And that sentence triggered the fastest economic transformation the world had ever seen. Overnight, peasants became entrepreneurs. The countryside became factories. Foreign investors, first from Japan, then from America, then later from Europe, saw a gold mine. Cheap labor, unlimited capacity, a state eager to make deals. China opened a handful of special economic zones. Small test cities where the rules were different. No central planning, no bureaucratic drag, no ideological purity tests. Just one goal: attract capital and create exports. It worked better than anyone needed it to. Shenzhen, a sleepy fishing town of 30,000 people, transformed into a metropolis of millions within a decade. The formula spread across the entire country. Every province wanted its own boom. Every city wanted to be the next Shenzhen. Local governments borrowed and built. Highways, power plants, industrial parks, all to attract more factories. By the early 2000s, China was not just growing. It was consuming the world's demand for everything: steel, coal, copper, oil. Every Western company that wanted to survive moved its production there. If something could be made, it would eventually be made in China. Western consumers found what they were looking for: the $5 t-shirt, the $300 iPhone, the illusion of abundance without inflation. And China got rich, at a speed far beyond what anyone had predicted. The fastest development process in history. But nobody stopped to ask exactly what was making this miracle possible. The answer was simple and dangerous. Success meant producing cheaper than everyone else. Every local government cut land prices to attract factories, cut taxes, cut wages. Every firm cut margins for market share, cut quality, cut profit. Everyone was chasing growth. Nobody was thinking about sustainability, because growth silenced every question. This was a race to the bottom dressed up as development, and it worked so well that for years nobody noticed. Workers poured in from the countryside in enormous numbers. Every year, millions of people were willing to work 12-hour days for a fraction of Western wages. Factories never stopped. Ports never slept. But somewhere between the 10th new shopping mall and the 100th steel mill, the system began to malfunction. The miracle became an addiction. Local governments needed growth to repay the loans they had taken to build more factories, so they built even more. By 2015, China's steel capacity alone exceeded the combined total of the rest of the world. Entire industrial zones were producing far more goods than global demand could ever absorb. Prices began to collapse, not because of innovation, because of desperation. When profits disappeared, factories did not slow down. They accelerated, hoping volume could compensate for loss. It could not. That is when a new word began circulating through the system: involution. A word borrowed from the human world, now describing an economic reality. Involution briefly means the excessive and self-consuming competition for limited resources and opportunities. Competition that is no longer about innovation, but purely about survival. A zero-sum war, where the only remaining weapon is price. In the past, this word was used to describe Chinese students or workers exhausting themselves for shrinking rewards, but now it is industrial, systemic, solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, all symbols of China's new economy. All became a battleground at once. Hundreds of firms, most of them state-backed, flooded markets with identical products, each one cutting prices to underbid the next, some beginning to produce at a loss. Margins disappeared, but nobody dared to stop. Because in this system, production is legitimacy. Stopping production means losing face. Politically unacceptable. The cycle fed itself. Firms slashed prices to keep market share. Competitors followed. Profits collapsed. Wages stalled. Consumers watched with cheer for a while, until they realized that cheap abundance was the reason prosperity was disappearing. In 2024, despite record exports, industrial profits fell by more than 20%. Solar panels are selling below cost. More than 100 Chinese electric vehicle brands are fighting for the same shrinking domestic market. Tech giants are competing for the same contracting demand while their valuations tumble. Because when everyone is competing to be the cheapest, price becomes the only thing left that can fall. This is not capitalism in overdrive. It is capitalism eating itself. And here is where the irony begins. China has seen this before. In the 2000s, when overproduction in coal and steel pushed prices to the floor, Beijing was forced to intervene by force. It closed mines, merged plants, fired hundreds of thousands of workers. It was painful, but it worked. 2 decades later, the same thing is happening again. But this time, the patient is not a single sector. It is the entire growth model. And this time, Beijing cannot write the same prescription. Factories do not close because a spreadsheet says they should. They close when politics permits. And in China, politics does not reward contraction. It rewards motion, even if that motion is running in circles. Behind closed doors, party officials know the numbers: falling profits, stalled wages, rising debt. But publicly, the message remains the same. Keep producing, keep growing, keep believing. Because if the machine stops, so does the illusion. But this story has a darker layer. Not all of this is a mistake. Some of it is deliberate. China's government has long mastered the art of weaponized efficiency, keeping key sectors alive with subsidies long enough to crush their competition. This is not about quarterly profit. It is about strategic monopoly. In solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles, Beijing does not mind losing money in the short term. It wants control of the future. Local governments pour billions into factories, cheap loans, and tax breaks so companies can sell products below cost, not to survive, but to eliminate rivals. The logic is ruthless. Flood the market, undercut everyone. Wait. Western competitors, bound by private shareholders and short-term profit demands, cannot keep up. They fold. And once the global supply chain depends on Chinese production, China can do what monopolies have always done: raise prices, dictate terms, dominate the value chain. This playbook is not new. It is the same one China used with steel, rare earth metals, and shipbuilding. In each case, it underpriced the world until the world had no other option. But this time the scale is unprecedented. These are not old industrial commodities. Lithium batteries, photovoltaic cells, electric drive trains, the arteries of the 21st century economy. In theory, it is genius. In practice, it is fragile. Because there is a limit to how long an empire can lose money, even strategically, before the system begins to rot. When every sector expects the government to absorb its losses, efficiency becomes addiction. Firms stop competing on innovation and start competing on subsidies. Productivity turns into politics, and the line between national strategy and national liability begins to disappear. Every dollar spent keeping factories alive today is borrowed from tomorrow's stability. Eventually, someone has to pay the bill. China did not invent this trap. History did. Britain's coal industry flooded global markets so cheaply that even British miners could no longer make a living. The solution? Colonies, captive markets, to absorb the excess. Japan hit the same wall in the 1980s. Overcapacity, deflation, an aging population that stopped spending, one lost decade, then two. In Rome, the fall did not begin with invasion. Vast estates worked by slaves pumped out so much grain that prices collapsed. Small farmers went bankrupt. The backbone of their republic snapped. Rome fed itself into imbalance. Every empire that masters efficiency eventually faces the same question. Can it stop optimizing long enough to survive? China's leaders know this. That is why they talk endlessly about rebalancing. Shifting from investment-driven growth to consumption, developing domestic demand, moving up from manufacturing to innovation. But rebalancing takes time, and time is the one resource a system addicted to growth cannot afford. While Beijing tries to steer the ship toward innovation and consumption, its provinces are still building more factories, more infrastructure, more output. Because that is what their incentives demand. That is what their debt requires. That is the only language the system has learned to speak. It is like trying to diet while the kitchen keeps cooking. And here is the cruelest irony of this era. Many of China's most overproduced goods, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, are precisely what the world needs for the energy transition. But when prices collapse and companies fail, even green revolutions can stall. The rest of the world gets cheaper technology at the cost of China's own profitability and industrial health. Cheap abundance becomes a trap, not because it fails to create wealth, but because it destroys the motivation to create more. And once that happens, efficiency turns from a virtue into a disease. So what should you take from this? First, efficiency without balance is not strength. It is slow collapse. Record export numbers in factories running at maximum capacity are sometimes warning signs rather than victories. What matters is not how much a system produces, but how much it earns from production. Second, the race to the bottom always ends the same way. Nobody wins. Not the country flooding the market, not the workers whose wages stagnate, not the consumers whose apparent prosperity is built on another nation's self-destruction. When price becomes the only weapon, there are no winners in the war. Third, follow the pattern. The sector changes. The underlying logic does not. Overproduction, deflation, debt, and a long, painful reckoning. This logic operates every single time, only with a different stage and a different costume. China's problem is not too little productivity. It is too much. An empire that has mastered production but lost its balance. A system that can flood the world with goods yet cannot generate enough demand to make it profitable. There is a cruel symmetry in that. The very force that made China rich, relentless competition, now ensures that nobody can rest long enough to stay rich. This is what happens when growth becomes identity. When production replaces purpose. When the measure of success becomes how cheaply you can make something that nobody needs more of. This is not development, it is evolution on an industrial scale. And like every empire that came before it, China is learning that there's nothing more expensive than being too cheap. Because when a system optimizes everything except balance, eventually the only thing left to destroy is itself. If you are curious about the dark and unlit corners of history, the powerful forces have long tried to keep hidden, do not forget to subscribe.